Hello, I'm Jennifer of Jen and Coco. I hope you all are having a wonderful day today. Hope you have your mugs of hot chocolate ready because we're going to be diving into talking more about our Flaunal and Avian culture. So, I've got a lot planned, so let's get into it. Okay, so last Wednesday, we ended kind of with a note of we haven't really talked much about the life cycle of one of our Flaunal creatures, and really, or our avian creatures either. And as we get into some more aspects of our society here, it might be important to know kind of how does youth work, how does old age work, and just kind of what is the typical expected course of action for aging throughout these creatures in this society. So, we're going to dive into that. Let me just pull up the... Give me one moment. This is... We're having trouble finding the right document for a moment. Okay. So, here we have... So, we need to talk more about... So, we need to talk about our life cycle here. And y'all should be able to see that. Very good. So, let's start with just like... We mentioned last Wednesday that the average lifespan for these creatures is 60, 70 years. So, comparable but shorter than... Comparable but shorter than a human's. 60 to 70 years with the Flaunal creatures generally outliving the avian creatures, assuming that they're able to get to old age. Okay, so yeah, lifespan about 60 to 70 years. Flaunal creatures generally outliving the avian ones in old age. So, as we're carrying on here, we have some things to consider. So we know roughly how birth cycles follow. Birth cycles creatures are born in the spring, in late winter, early spring. So let's see. Typically born late winter, early spring. With avian creatures being born before Flaunal creatures, generally speaking. Typically born late winter, early spring, avian creatures being born before their Flaunal siblings. By a couple weeks at the most. It's not a very, very large difference between them. So, okay. Late winter, early spring, avian creatures born before the Flaunal ones. Other things would be such as, and the creatures born in the same cycle would be considered nestmates. So, yeah, young born to the same mating trio in the same cycle, or in the same season, are considered nestmates or close siblings. Okay, so they'll typically live so the nestmates will typically live in the nest for it's less than a year, because it'll make sense for them to have moved out to make room for their younger siblings, essentially, to make room for their younger siblings within the nest. And I should repeat the fact that when I say nest, I am talking about the nest that has grown on top of the flaunal creatures from what used to be their root system. And so that is what I'm talking about here. So I think one thing that'll be important in this is that, one, most of these creatures are not going to be small creatures, particularly the flaunal creatures. They will get fairly large enough to at least comfortably carry a couple pounds worth of creatures on their head at any given point. Considering that the birds, I believe I said that our avian creature, or avian species, was about... Okay, it doesn't look like I actually wrote down a weight. But I was kind of imagining a pound and a half. Or at least at full maturity. So at least the mating trio portion of this, or at least, yeah, the two avians, that's, we'll say 3 to 4 pounds that a flaunal elk creature will be carrying on its head once it's reached full maturity at any given point, and that's not even including its potential young that it will also be carrying, at least for that first year, or for their first year. So after a couple months, essentially, I think it's going to be once the flaunal child. Once the flaunal child is large enough to leave the nest, not to leave the nest, to support its siblings, or its avian siblings in its own nest. Yeah, once the flaunal child is large enough to support its avian siblings, and this is close siblings, in its own nest, it'll do so. Or the nestmates will move out of the parent's nest. Now they'll still be living with their parents, and this is still considered youth here. So these would still be considered young flaunal creatures. They're just not babies or toddlers anymore, as it were. These would be closer to kids or teens, as iron, potentially. And they would live like this for a few years. I'm thinking maybe 2 to 5 years of living like this, pretty much while they are reaching sexual maturation. And actually, one thing I should look up is when are birds typically able to hummingbird life cycle. Let's That is going to take a moment to find out, but... So, okay. I'm seeing anywhere with that for birds reaching sexual maturity is anywhere between 6 months to 6 years. So actually, yeah, that kind of time frame kind of fits with what we were saying already. Yeah, awesome. I like when things mesh up like that. So, yeah, once the Flaunal child is large enough to support its avian nestmates, that entire group will move out of the parent's nest, and will... Nestmates will live with each other for... Actually, on the way to say... approximately... let's say... 8 to 10 months. Actually, 8 to 9 months. Yeah. So now, nestmates will live with each other for 5 to 6 years. I can spell, hello. Before leaving each other to find their... to find a mating... And nestmates will live with each other or live with each other for 5 to 6 years before leaving each other to find a mating trio. So, from this, so that kind of details the lifespan of youth. You got essentially birth. You and the siblings that you are born with at the same time as will live in the nest for about 8 to 9 months. At which point, your Flaunal sibling will be large enough to support you and your other avian siblings. From that point on, y'all will live together for about 5 to 6 years, and then y'all will disperse, do mating rituals and all that, and find, yeah, and we'll then start living your adult life. So essentially, that would be your coming of age moment. Ooh, that actually brings up of... mating rituals and coming of age rituals are related. Okay. So, the next thing after this would be, then you're living your adult life, and you'd be, essentially, if you're a Flaunal creature, you'd be working, likely doing some sort of food or material gathering or processing. So, carpentry, woodworking, hunting, fishing, anything like that. Whereas the avian creatures would be doing more scout or messenger roles, or parenting and caretaking would be a large part of their roles as well. So, as we carry on with this, the next things that would come about would be... Yes, okay, so following what we have here. So then after, so yeah, let's see. Adults live their lives. Performing jobs. Raising young. And I feel like there's one other thing I was going to mention. Yeah, there. And then, I don't know if and when there comes a point when the flaunal creatures are no longer sexually viable, or when the female avian creatures are no longer sexually viable. I haven't really thought too much about that. It's something that we'll keep in mind, but because it is possible that the flaunal creatures are just always continuously viable, but I don't think that that would necessarily be the case with the avian creatures. Yeah, that's something to think about in a future time. It's not something I really want to cover right now. And that's if we feel the need to cover that. There's a few things that might distinguish, but for the most part, it shouldn't be of too much importance to my knowledge. So, however, as you live your adult life, you do age, and eventually these creatures will reach elderly-ishness. It's a bit of a vague concept. There's no set, like, this is when you're considered old. But as you age, there is a general respect for those who are older, particularly generationally speaking. But also, there is an extent to which actual physical age is considered a sign of respect and status. So, as one ages, some of their roles might change in society. Just to figure out how these roles are going to change, though, is the real question. So first we have... one thing we mentioned is that the avian creatures are apt to die. Assuming nothing is getting in the way, everyone's living to old age, the avian creatures will die before the flaunal creatures. Maybe by 10 years tops, 20 years absolute maximum difference. But usually it's more like 4 or 5 years is the difference between when the avian creatures die and when the flaunal creature, or when their flaunal part of that mating trio dies. So let's see, other things. We have, so adults live their lives, performing jobs, raising young, and then elderly, the elderly will options. So, yeah, how do the, I mean, I want some change in the elderly creatures' roles. I think one thing is that, I think actually let's go ahead and say that yes, for sure that there is a end to when the avian creatures are able to, at least the female avian creatures are able to reproduce. And that is one sign that the mating trio has reached into old age. So it's when that elderly is when the female avian creature is no longer producing children. So the elderly will be and I don't think it's specifically when the female avian creature is no longer able to bear offspring. I think if any of the trio was no longer able to bear offspring, that there would be kind of a elderly status applied to them, because, oh hey, they're no longer able to have kids. However, it's typically going to be when the female avian creature is no longer able to bear offspring, and there may even be terminology, like specific terminologies, like for false elderly, for if for whatever reason they are choosing not to have children, or they are no longer able to, or they are not able to have children at a way earlier age than expected, or than is normal. So let's see. So yeah, mating trios are seen as elderly when the female avian creature is no longer able to birth offspring. Or when any of them are no longer able to bear offspring, or they choose not to bear more offspring. Because we're still in a society where choosing not to have offspring is a odd and unusual choice, at least at this point in the culture. We do not have the modern medicine at this point. Modern medicine and that sort of stuff has not evolved. Child mortality rates are higher than they will be in the future. So bearing lots of offspring provides more chance for the survival of everyone. So, not just the survival, the flourishment of everyone. So, possibly also this happens earlier than is culturally / biologically normal. They may have a term meaning false elder may arise. Particularly if there becomes a trend of mating trios ceasing to have children early, specifically to gain that elderly status. And that this would be kind of a, oh, y'all aren't actually elderly, because y'all chose to stop having kids. That's not worth, y'all aren't deserving of the title of elder at this point. So, now, the next thing is the elderly. Elderly take more leadership roles, particularly within the family. This is where your head of households will come in. Leadership's roles for potential governments and such. This would also be kind of where mentors would more be a thing. Having an elderly mentor would be preferred to having an adult mentor. So yeah, the elderly take more leadership roles, particularly within the family, teaching, guiding, leading the younger generations. And then eventually we reach death. Now there's some questions here. We guys will say this specifically. It's around 60 to 70 for flaunal creatures. And around 55, so we'll say 50 to 65 for avian creatures. So we'll take out this upper. Now, there's a couple questions that come up, since we know that death is not just an old age issue. There are other times in a lifespan that people can die. There are a couple times when this might become important when it takes away a societal role. For instance, if the flaunal child in a nestmate, for whatever reason, is not present, let's say either child mortality, infant mortality, or some such thing, the avian creatures will likely live with, or the avian creatures of that nest will likely live with one of their other siblings, or or a close family member of a similar age within that larger family structure, and essentially that would be like their adopted nestmates, and that would likely become a official term for nestmates that you weren't born in the same season with, but that you have lived with for a time because of practical reasons. So let's get into this. If the flaunal nestmate is not able to fulfill the role of housing for their avian siblings due to weakness, death, etc., they will live with other siblings, other flaunal siblings, who have not yet reached adulthood. Essentially, who don't have their own mating trio to look after, to house. So they will also, the avian creatures will live with their other flaunal siblings, and they may move. They may first live with an older one, and then once that one reaches adulthood, they will live with the younger one for the remaining years before they themselves reach adulthood. This creates a term for adoptive nestmates that we'll get into once we start getting into coining more terminology in this society. Okay. Other things. If at any point, the really important ones is when flaunal creatures die, because that leaves essentially the avian creatures as homeless. However, at any point in time when a member of a mating trio perishes for any reason, that creates unique challenges for the other members of that trio. So, if a member of a mating trio dies, complications arise if the Flaunal creature perishes. Then the avian mates will find themselves homeless. Until for them to find a new Flaunal mate. There are a couple options here. And the reason why that it would be important for them to find a new Flaunal mate is specifically because they would no longer be able to. Essentially, that's their home. That is their protection. It would be difficult for them to live without a Flaunal host. Now there are some options. One, they could. First, actually, they could live with an elderly. Yeah, they may live with an elderly Flaunal creature in the household. Especially whose avian halves, let's say, have already passed on. So essentially, they would make their home within, or with the avian, with that Flaunal, with one of their Flaunal, not ancestors, because they actually wouldn't be related by blood to that Flaunal creature. They would be related by marriage. But then they would actually become false elders, because they would no longer produce or they would no longer attempt to produce offspring. However, so that is one option. Another option is, of course, remarriage, if such an option is if such a combination is possible. Unfortunately, because of the fact that because there's 3 people in a relationship, if only one dies, and let's just say that one dies across 3 different relationships, it's not necessarily a simple matter of, oh hey, just remarry, because now you have, because you would still have, because if there's 2 mating trios that have only one of their members perish, that would mean that you would have 4 people trying to mate, which they may try and make work, but I don't think so. I don't think that, at least early on, or at least right now in our culture, I don't think that that's going to be something that they would try and make viable. And there is an extent where, if it is one of the avian creatures that perishes, things are going to be alright. They may be considered, they'll probably, the remaining parts of the trio would be considered false elders, because they would no longer be able to produce avian offspring. They could produce Flaunal offspring. Whether they choose to or not is a different story. However, so let's see, they may live with an elderly Flaunal creature, or they may also remarry if a lone actually, in any scenario in which a member dies, remarriage. We're using marriage here loosely because this is not a marriage is not exactly what's happening here, but remarriage is a possibility. However, it is relatively uncommon due to due to circumstances, due to relatively uncommon. Oh. However, it is relatively uncommon due to logistical issues. We'll just put it there. We'll just leave it at that on paper. So yeah, due to logistical issues. That said, it is possible that a younger creature that just reached adulthood may be able to fulfill that role, and that may be where a remarriage is more likely. But it'd be like one is a new to marriage in general, and the other two are remarrying versus everyone involved is remarrying. Remarriage is more common when the third member is just reached adulthood. Okay. That is a lot right there. Trying to think if there's anything else like basic life cycle stuff to consider. So typically born late winter, early spring. So we have a rough lifespan, time frame, life cycle thing. Essentially we cover the time frame and the rough concept of youth. We haven't really talked about what they are doing while they are before they reach maturity. I think part of it is that they are starting to learn, particularly the flaunal creatures are starting to learn like the family trade, and the avian creatures are essentially preparing themselves for marriage. I realize I'm starting to get a very, to my knowledge, very traditional Indo-European, or at least traditional European masculine-feminine distinction here between our Flaunal and Avian creatures. There are some small differences, but this is really becoming a big, we're the ones who work, and we're the ones who breed and raise the family. But unlike with humans, this actually makes, well, okay, actually, let me take that back. I was about to say it makes sense, but not quite. It's more of, I can't think of what jobs the avian creatures would have besides being primary caretakers. Largely because of the lack of hands. That's what a lot of it is coming down to. So, okay, but I think we've covered a decent bit, and then we've talked a little bit about what the avian roles here. So let's write down what we had in mind for. While in their youth, Flaunal creatures will learn the family trade from their elders, and avian creatures will learn avian stuff. Caretaking, and other avian societal roles. Okay. I think that covers most everything that I can think of right now, at least. So I think we're going to leave it here today. And we'll be back here on Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern. I believe we're going to be talking more about honorifics, since we kind of left off with that again last week. Or not last week, I keep saying last week. Last Wednesday. And we'll be talking about some of the differences between honorifics and formality when it comes to being outside, when it comes to creatures outside of the family. So I hope y'all are have a wonderful rest of your day. I'm going to hop on Twitch in about 15-20 minutes. So feel free to join me there as well if you'd like to continue watching. And thank you for everyone who joined me today, and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your days. See you on Monday. Bye!